My name is Madeline. I am 34 years old and a commercial real estate cash flow analyst. I spend my days evaluating assets, identifying liabilities, and knowing exactly when to cut losses on a bankrupt investment. For my entire life, I tried to view my family as a long-term investment, hoping my patience would eventually yield a return of genuine love. But last Sunday, my mother looked across a linen-covered table and banned my 10-year-old daughter from her 60th birthday gala because my child was not photogenic enough. I did not scream or flip the table. I simply walked away. Exactly 4 weeks later, I had a uniformed legal courier deliver a heavily framed 30-day eviction notice to my mother right in the middle of her lavish party, exposing her federal mortgage fraud to 100 wealthy guests. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago meant maintaining a flawless exterior at all costs. To the outside world, my parents Brenda and Thomas were the picture of upper-middle-class success. Our sprawling Tudor-style home with its manicured hedges and imported marble driveway was a fortress of expectations. Inside, the emotional coldness permeated every room. My younger sister Courtney was the undisputed golden child. She possessed the perfect smile, the effortless charm, and an uncanny ability to manipulate my mother into giving her whatever she desired. Meanwhile, I was the pragmatic one, the scapegoat, who worked 2 jobs in college while Courtney maxed out my parents' credit cards. I eventually escaped their toxic dynamic by building my own career, but I maintained a polite distance for the sake of my daughter Sophie. I wanted her to have a relationship with her grandparents. That desperate hope shattered completely last Sunday. We were sitting in the main dining room of the Oak Ridge Country Club for our obligatory family brunch. The crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting a warm glow on the pristine white tablecloths. Heavy silver cutlery clinked against fine china as the local elite gossiped over mimosas and eggs Benedict. I sat quietly next to Sophie, helping her cut her waffles. Across the table, my mother Brenda held court. She wore a tailored designer blazer and sipped her champagne with an air of absolute superiority. Next to her sat my father Thomas, a man who had spent 3 decades enabling her worst behavior just to keep the peace. On the other side was Courtney, smirking at her phone, while her husband Jamal, a boisterous African-American tech startup founder from Atlanta, loudly bragged about his phantom investors. Brenda tapped her manicured nails against her crystal glass to command our attention. She smiled radiantly and announced the final plans for her upcoming 60th birthday gala. She had booked the grand ballroom at the club, hired a 12-piece string quartet, and secured a photographer from a prominent regional lifestyle magazine to document the event. "That sounds wonderful, Mom," I said sincerely, wiping a drop of syrup from Sophie's chin. "Sophie and I will make sure to dress perfectly for the occasion. Sophie has a beautiful velvet dress she has been dying to wear." Brenda stopped smiling. The temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. She set her champagne flute down and looked at me as if I had just tracked mud onto a white carpet. "Madeline, please," Brenda said, her voice dripping with casual cruelty. "You are invited, of course. But Sophie cannot come. This is an elegant evening, not a children's pizza party." I froze. "Sophie is your only granddaughter," I replied, keeping my voice low so the neighboring tables would not hear. "It is a family celebration. Why would she not be included?" Brenda let out a theatrical sigh, leaning forward. She glanced pointedly at Sophie's mouth. "Because, Madeline, I have a professional photographer coming for the magazine spread. Sophie just got those hideous metal braces on her teeth. They look incredibly cheap. I am not having my legacy photos ruined by a mouthful of wire. She can stay home." The silence that followed was deafening. My 10-year-old daughter just sat there frozen, staring down at her plate of half-eaten waffles. Her small shoulders slumped, but she did not cry. My heart shattered for her, but a cold, hard rage immediately took its place. I looked around the table, waiting for someone, anyone, to defend my child. My father Thomas intensely focused on cutting his steak, refusing to make eye contact with either of us. Courtney simply smirked, taking a slow sip of her mimosa, clearly enjoying my humiliation. Jamal did not even look up from his phone. In my profession, I know exactly when a negotiation is dead. There was nothing left to salvage here. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or give them the satisfaction of a dramatic scene. I silently reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it onto the pristine white tablecloth to cover our meals. "Grab your coat, sweetheart," I said softly to Sophie. "We are leaving." "Madeline, do not be so dramatic," Brenda scoffed, rolling her eyes. I did not answer. I took my daughter's hand, turned my back on the people who were supposed to be my family, and walked out of the dining room with my head held high. I knew right then that I was done playing the dutiful daughter. It was time to close the account on this family for good. The heavy mahogany doors of the country club closed behind us with a definitive thud, cutting off the hum of elite chatter and the clinking of crystal. The crisp November air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. I kept my grip on Sophie's hand firm and steady as we walked down the sweeping stone steps toward the valet stand. She matched my pace perfectly, her small dress shoes clicking against the pavement in a quiet rhythm. I handed my ticket to the attendant in silence. Neither of us spoke while we waited for my SUV to be brought around. I did not offer hollow comfort. I did not crouch down and tell her that her grandmother did not mean it. Sophie is 10, but she is perceptive. She knew exactly what had just happened, and lying to her would only insult her intelligence. When the valet pulled the car up, I tipped him and opened the rear door for Sophie. She climbed in, buckling her seatbelt with mechanical stiffness. I slid into the driver's seat, gripped the leather steering wheel, and pulled out onto the winding, tree-lined road that led away from the estate. The drive was swallowed by a heavy, suffocating silence. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the rhythmic thumping of the tires against the asphalt. Streetlights washed rhythmically over the interior of the car, casting fleeting shadows. I adjusted the rear-view mirror, angling it so I could see my daughter in the back seat. Sophie was not crying. Her eyes were dry, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She reached into her small velvet purse resting on her lap. Slowly, she pulled out a folded piece of heavy construction paper. It was the birthday card she had spent 3 hours making the night before. I remembered watching her carefully select the perfect shades of marker, meticulously drawing a massive cake, and writing a heartfelt message in her neatest cursive, completely ignoring the ache in her jaw from her new braces. In the reflection of the mirror, I watched her stare at the brightly colored paper. Then, with a chilling calmness that mirrored my own, she began to tear it. She did not rip it in a fit of rage. She did not sob or throw it on the floor. Instead, her small fingers pinched the edges, pulling the paper apart in slow, deliberate motions. She tore it in half, then into quarters. She kept dividing the pieces methodically, reducing her painstaking artwork into tiny, perfectly square fragments. She gathered the colorful confetti in her palm, holding onto the ruined pieces of her own affection. Watching her do that broke something fundamental inside of me. But it also crystallized everything. In my line of work as a commercial real estate cash flow analyst, my entire existence revolves around numbers, projections, and harsh realities. I spend my days staring at spreadsheets evaluating multi-million-dollar properties and identifying toxic assets. I know how to calculate net operating income. I know how to spot a failing venture disguised by a shiny facade. Most importantly, I know exactly when an investor needs to cut their losses. For 34 years, I had treated my family like a distressed property with potential. I had foolishly believed that if I just invested enough patience, enough money, enough understanding, the foundation would eventually stabilize. I kept paying the emotional maintenance costs, hoping for a return on investment that was never going to come. My parents and my sister were a classic case of the sunk cost fallacy. I had poured decades of effort into trying to earn a seat at a table where the game was rigged against me from the start. Looking at my daughter methodically destroying her own heart in the back seat, the analyst in me finally took over completely. Brenda Thomas and Courtney were not family. They were a bankrupt asset. They were a liability actively draining my most precious resource, which was my daughter's sense of self-worth. You do not negotiate with toxic debt. You liquidate it. You close the account, take the penalty, and walk away before it bankrupts you. We pulled into the driveway of our quiet suburban home. The motion sensor floodlights snapped on, illuminating the familiar surroundings. I put the car in park and turned off the engine. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice steady in the quiet cabin. Sophie looked up from the pile of torn paper in her lap. "Yes, Mom," she said softly, opening her car door. "Let us go inside." As we walked up to the front porch, the silence of the night was suddenly shattered. My cell phone, buried deep inside my purse, began to vibrate violently. Then it pinged. Then it rang. The rapid-fire notifications echoed in the quiet air. The fallout from my abrupt exit had officially begun. I pulled the phone from my purse as I unlocked the front door and ushered Sophie inside. The lock screen was a waterfall of notifications, mostly from the family group chat that my mother had pretentiously named the estate. I did not need to open the messages to know the narrative they were spinning. I swiped the phone to silent and tossed it onto the kitchen counter. My priority was the 10-year-old girl standing in the hallway carefully taking off her coat. I walked Sophie up the stairs to her bedroom. We went through her normal nighttime routine in a quiet, comforting rhythm. She brushed her teeth, carefully cleaning around the new braces that had supposedly disqualified her from her own grandmother's family photos. I tucked her into bed, pulling the thick duvet up to her chin. I smoothed her hair back from her forehead and kissed her cheek. "You did nothing wrong today, Sophie," I told her, making sure my voice was steady and absolute. "You are beautiful and you are valued, and I will never let anyone make you feel otherwise. Do you understand me?" She nodded, her eyes heavy with emotional exhaustion. "I love you, Mom," she whispered. I turned on her nightlight and softly closed the door behind me. Once I was back in the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of cold water, leaned against the marble island, and finally picked up my phone. The group chat was a masterclass in gaslighting. Courtney had sent a barrage of texts. "I cannot believe you just walked out like that," the first message read. "You made a massive scene in front of the entire country club. Mom is literally in tears in the bathroom. You are so incredibly selfish, Madeline, always trying to make everything about you." I rolled my eyes. Walking out silently and paying my own bill was hardly a scene, but in Courtney's world, any action that did not cater to Brenda was an act of war. Next was a 2-minute voice note from my mother. I tapped play, holding the phone away from my ear. Brenda's voice flowed out, trembling with calculated heartbreak. "Madeline, I simply do not understand why you are doing this to me," she whimpered, her tone thick with artificial sorrow. "I work so hard to keep this family together. I plan these beautiful events to give us memories, and you ruin it over a simple aesthetic decision. The photographer needs uniformity. It is not a personal attack on Sophie. But of course you have to play the victim. You have broken my heart. I hope you are happy." I deleted the voice note before it even finished playing. It was the same script she had used since I was a teenager, designed to make me apologize for her cruelty. But the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer a desperate kid seeking her approval. I was about to put the phone down and head to bed when a direct message popped up. It was not in the group chat. It was a private text from Jamal, my brother-in-law. Jamal had married Courtney 3 years ago. He was an ambitious guy from a wealthy Atlanta logistics family, and he loved to present himself as a tech visionary. He was always pitching some new app that was going to disrupt an industry, yet he never seemed to have any actual revenue. I opened his text. It was a solid block of condescending demands. "Listen, Madeline, you need to stop acting like a bitter widow and get over yourself," Jamal wrote. "You are overreacting about a kid not coming to a fancy dinner. Hire a babysitter for one night. You are coming to this gala alone, and you are going to play nice. My parents and my uncle are flying in from Atlanta for this party. Brenda promised to officially introduce my startup to them as a joint family venture so I can secure my seed funding. I need my investors to see a united, successful family backing me. Do not mess this up for my business just because your feelings got hurt." I stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. Jamal was not defending Brenda out of loyalty. He was defending her because he needed his wealthy family to think Brenda was a powerful, wealthy matriarch backing his app. Brenda was using the party as a stage play, and Jamal was using Brenda as a prop to get his family's money. A cold, sharp smile spread across my face. The analyst in me saw the entire board clearly now. Jamal believed Brenda was his primary financial backer. He believed the estate was the rock-solid foundation of his seed funding pitch. I locked my phone and set it on the counter. The audacity was almost impressive. Jamal wanted me to play my part in their little financial theater, but Jamal was building his entire tech empire on a foundation of sand, and I was the one holding the deed to the beach. I tapped the screen and dialed his number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. The background noise sounded like a loud television, likely a basketball game, judging by the squeaking sneakers and crowd cheers. "What is it?" Madeline. Jamal answered, his tone laced with heavy exasperation. "If you are calling to complain about Brenda, save it. I am not your therapist, and I do not have time for your drama tonight." I did not raise my voice. I leaned against the cool marble of my kitchen island and switched seamlessly into my corporate persona. "I am not calling about my mother, Jamal. I am calling about your app, the logistics platform you are supposedly pitching to your wealthy family this weekend." There was a brief pause on the line. He clearly had not expected this pivot. The defensive wall went up immediately. "Yeah, what about it?" "I am just curious," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral, utilizing the exact same cadence I use to interrogate brokers who present overvalued commercial assets. "What is your current burn rate? You have been in the development phase for over 2 years now. Are you generating any actual recurring revenue? Or are you still entirely reliant on blind angel funding to keep your servers running?" "Excuse me," Jamal snapped, his voice rising in volume, the arrogance bleeding through his fake professional veneer. "Since when do you care about my business model? Since you decided my daughter being excluded from a family event is an acceptable casualty for your seed funding," I replied smoothly. "If my physical presence is required to secure your investment, I want to know if the underlying asset is even viable. So what is your customer acquisition cost? How much runway do you actually have left before you go bankrupt?" Jamal let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "You think because you stare at spreadsheets for some mid-level real estate firm, you understand the tech industry. My valuation is based on user growth potential and market disruption, not your outdated traditional cash flow metrics. You would not get it." "I understand that zero revenue means you are bleeding cash," I countered, relentless but completely calm. "You have no product. You have a pitch deck. You are desperate. That is why you need your uncle and your parents from Atlanta to open their wallets and save you." The television in the background was abruptly muted. Jamal was furious now. His breathing was heavy against the receiver. "Listen to me very carefully, Madeline. Stop acting like a bitter widow who wants everyone else to be as miserable as she is. Just because your life stopped when your husband died does not mean the rest of us have to put our ambitions on hold." The insult was designed to gut me. It was a low blow, weaponizing the tragic loss of my husband to win a petty argument. But it barely grazed my armor. I saw right through it. He was trying to deflect from his own deep financial insecurity by attacking my grief. It was textbook manipulation from a man who knew he was failing. "Get a babysitter," Jamal commanded, mistaking my silence for submission. "Put on a nice dress, fix your attitude, and show up on Saturday." Brenda is the primary financial backer for this entire venture. She is putting up the family estate as collateral to match whatever my family invests. This party is not just a birthday celebration. It is a networking front to close the deal. If you ruin her image in front of my investors by boycotting the dinner, you are ruining my company, and I will not let you do that. I processed his words carefully, letting the magnitude of his confession wash over me. Brenda was putting up the family estate as collateral. She was promising him equity she did not possess. The sheer scale of her delusion was breathtaking. She was not just emotionally abusing her family anymore. She was actively preparing to commit federal financial fraud to maintain her fake image as a wealthy matriarch. "Brenda told you she is backing your company with the estate?" I asked. making sure I heard him perfectly, ensuring he was fully implicating himself in her web of lies. Yes, Jamal spat back, oozing with unearned confidence. Because she actually believes in my vision. Unlike you, she knows how to build a legacy. So fall in line, Madeline. He was so incredibly blind. He genuinely thought he was playing the role of a ruthless corporate visionary, but he was just a gullible pawn in Brenda's pathological lies. He was about to ask his wealthy relatives to invest millions in a shell company backed by stolen equity. I understand completely, Jamal, I said. My voice was chillingly calm, completely devoid of the anger he so desperately wanted to provoke. I will not interfere with your pitch. Let us see what your backer actually owns. Before he could respond, I ended the call. I set the phone down on the counter and walked over to the large bay window overlooking my quiet street. Brenda and Jamal thought they were master manipulators controlling the board. They had no idea they were playing a game I had already won 5 years ago. The fluorescent lights of my downtown Chicago office were a welcome contrast to the emotional fog of the weekend. It was Monday morning, and I was exactly where I belonged. Sitting behind my sleek glass desk on the 30th floor, I was deep into a complex commercial ledger cross, referencing quarterly earnings for a massive multi-tenant retail space. Numbers made sense. They were logical. They did not lie, they did not manipulate, and they certainly did not gaslight you over brunch. I took a sip of my black coffee, feeling the familiar grounding rhythm of my work take hold. The predictability of commercial real estate was my sanctuary. Then a shadow fell across my doorway, disrupting the perfect order of my morning. I looked up from my dual monitors and saw my father, Thomas, standing on the other side of the soundproof glass wall. My assistant, normally fiercely protective of my schedule, gave me an apologetic shrug from her cubicle. Thomas pushed the heavy glass door open without waiting for an invitation. He was wearing his standard uniform of forced respectability, a slightly wrinkled beige trench coat over a gray suit that had been expensive a decade ago. His posture, however, betrayed him entirely. His shoulders were tight, and his eyes darted around my spacious office, as if calculating the exact cost of the modern furniture and the sweeping view of the city skyline. "Madeline," he said, offering a tight, forced smile that did not reach his eyes. "You are looking well. Nice office. A bit clinical, but very nice." I did not stand up to greet him. I closed my laptop, slowly folding my hands on the cool glass surface of my desk. "Dad, this is a surprise. I do not recall scheduling a meeting with you today." He chuckled nervously, stepping further into the room and taking a seat in the leather guest chair without being asked. He unbuttoned his coat, leaning forward with the practiced posture of a reasonable man, just trying to mediate a minor misunderstanding. "Come on, Maddie. We are family. I do not need an appointment to see my own daughter. I came because we need to clear the air after yesterday. Your mother is completely beside herself." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "Beside herself," I repeated flatly. "Is that what we are calling it now?" Thomas sighed, scrubbing a hand over his thinning hair. It was his signature move, the exhausted patriarch just trying to hold his difficult family together against all odds. "Look, you overreacted. You know how Brenda gets when she is planning a big event. She is a perfectionist. The magazine photographer made a passing comment about aesthetics, and she just panicked. It was not a personal attack on Sophie. Kids bounce back from these things quickly. You are turning a simple aesthetic choice into a massive Greek tragedy." "An aesthetic choice," I said, my voice dropping an octave, entirely devoid of emotion. "She told a 10-year-old girl she was too ugly to be in a family photo, Dad. And you sat there and cut your steak. You did not say a single word to defend your granddaughter." The reminder hit him like a physical blow, but he quickly recovered, reverting to his lifelong enabler script. "I was trying to keep the peace, Madeline. Someone has to do it. If I had started a fight right there in the dining room, it would have been a public disaster. We have an image to maintain." I leaned forward, matching his posture, but stripping away all the warmth. "There is no peace to keep anymore. I am setting a hard boundary right now, and I expect you to respect it." Sophie and I will not be attending the birthday gala. We are done playing props for her magazine spreads. The forced smile vanished from Thomas's face. The reasonable mediator act instantly evaporated, replaced by genuine, barely concealed panic. He gripped the armrests of the leather chair, his knuckles turning white under the strain. "You cannot do that," he said, his voice suddenly sharp and urgent. "You have to be there, Madeline. You have no idea what is riding on this weekend." "I know Jamal wants his seed funding," I replied calmly, refusing to absorb his anxiety. "That sounds like Jamal's problem, not mine." Thomas stood up abruptly, pacing the short distance between my desk and the glass wall. He looked out at the busy trading floor, then spun back to face me, his face flushed with uncharacteristic desperation. "This is not just about Jamal's stupid app," he hissed, dropping the volume of his voice as if someone might overhear us through the thick glass. "Your mother has promised his family that we are united in this. They are traditional, wealthy Southern investors. They need to see the whole family together, supporting this venture, or they will walk away from the table entirely. You being absent raises red flags we absolutely cannot afford." "Then I suggest Brenda finds a creative way to explain my absence," I said, opening my laptop again to signal the conversation was over, "because I am not changing my mind." Thomas planted his hands flat on my glass desk, leaning in close, his breath smelling faintly of antacids and stale coffee. His facade was completely shattered now, revealing a desperate, terrified man. "You do not understand, Madeline," he whispered, his eyes wide with a frantic fear I had never seen in him before. "His father built a massive logistics empire in Atlanta." Thomas confessed, his voice shaking as he leaned over the desk. "They are wealthy, Madeline, incredibly wealthy. But they are old school. They do not invest in tech apps or algorithms based on faith. They invest in hard assets, people, and collateral." I kept my expression entirely blank, letting him fill the silence. "Get to the point, Dad. Jamal convinced them to match whatever our family puts up for his seed round." Thomas rushed out, pulling a crumpled handkerchief from his pocket and wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Your mother wanted to look like a powerhouse to the Atlanta in-laws. She told them we are backing Jamal with $500,000. "And where exactly is Brenda getting $500,000 in liquid cash?" I asked, knowing full well my parents lived paycheck to paycheck just to maintain their country club membership and luxury car leases. Thomas swallowed hard. He looked down at the immaculate glass surface of my desk, unable to meet my gaze. "A home equity line of credit. A HELOC. Courtney and Jamal are taking out a $500,000 loan against the estate. Your mother authorized it as the property owner. The paperwork is already in motion with the bank. But Jamal's father is a very cautious man. He wants to fly up here, see the estate, and meet the entire family before he signs his end of the matching funds. He explicitly asked to meet Jamal's new extended family to ensure we are a stable, united front." Thomas gripped the edge of my desk, his knuckles turning white. "If you boycott the gala, he will start asking questions. He will think the family is fractured, and he will pull his half of the investment. If he pulls his half, Jamal's app is dead in the water, and the HELOC money will be wasted on a sinking ship." I slowly leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The pieces of their delusional puzzle were locking into place perfectly. In my mind, I was already running the risk assessment. "Let me make sure I understand this," I said, my voice perfectly steady and measured. "Brenda is allowing Courtney and Jamal to take out a $500,000 HELOC against the family estate." "Yes," Thomas hissed, his face flushed red. "And they need the matching funds from Atlanta to make the math work and get the business off the ground. Do you see now why you have to be there? This is not about a magazine photo anymore, Maddie. This is about survival. Your sister's future, your mother's reputation, my sanity. It is all riding on this weekend. Just put on a nice dress, hire a sitter for Sophie, and drink champagne for 3 hours. That is literally all I am asking." I looked at the man who had spent my entire life catering to my mother's narcissistic demands while ignoring my basic emotional needs. He looked small. He looked pathetic. He had absolutely no idea about the massive financial landmine he was currently standing on. "A $500,000 line of credit," I repeated softly, tasting the words. The sheer arrogance of the maneuver was staggering, using the estate as collateral. Yes, Thomas pleaded, again misinterpreting my calm repetition for understanding. So you will come. You will do this for the family. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored blazer. I walked around the desk and opened the heavy glass door of my office. I am going to say this one last time, Dad. I will not be at the country club on Saturday, and my daughter will not be attending either. My decision is final. Thomas stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. The panic in his eyes morphed into a deep, resentful anger. You are making a massive mistake, Madeline. He spat, his voice trembling with fury. If this deal falls through, your mother will never forgive you. You will be cut out of this family forever. That is the goal, Dad. I replied, my tone devoid of any warmth. Now please leave my office. I have actual assets to manage. Thomas glared at me for one long, silent second. Then he buttoned his wrinkled trench coat, turned on his heel, and stormed out. I watched through the transparent walls as he marched down the hallway, aggressively jabbing the elevator button. When the elevator doors finally closed behind him, I walked back to my desk and sat down. The quiet hum of the ventilation system filled the room. I was completely alone. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad or guilty. I reached over to my keyboard and woke up my dual monitors, the spreadsheets glowing on the screen reflected in my eyes. A slow, cold, highly analytical smile spread across my face. Thomas had just handed me the missing variable in their catastrophic financial equation. They were trying to secure a massive loan against a property they no longer legally owned. To secure a HELOC of that magnitude, the bank requires strict underwriting. They require property appraisals, comprehensive title searches, and notarized signatures from the actual legal property owner. Since Brenda was no longer the legal owner of the estate, she had to be falsifying those documents. She was likely forging my signature or creating fake transfer deeds. In real estate, attempting to leverage an asset without holding the title was not just a simple clerical mistake, it was a federal crime. My family was actively committing mortgage fraud, and I had the exact documentation locked in a bank vault needed to watch their entire house of cards collapse. I grabbed my tailored trench coat from the coat rack and walked out of my office. I told my assistant to cancel all my afternoon meetings and take my calls. I told her I would not be returning for the remainder of the day no matter who called. I needed to verify the physical evidence before I initiated the next phase of this demolition. I took the express elevator down to the underground parking garage and got into my SUV. The drive to the First National Trust branch in the financial district took less than 15 minutes, but my mind was moving 100 miles an hour. I was mentally reviewing state property laws and the exact penalties for wire fraud and falsifying a loan application. The irony was almost poetic. Brenda had spent her entire life curating an image of generational wealth and untouchable status, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire reality was legally owned by the daughter she despised. I pulled into the VIP parking area, flashed my corporate banking card to the security guard, and walked straight through the heavy glass doors. The bank manager greeted me by name and escorted me down the marble staircase to the secure subterranean vault. The air down there was always climate-controlled, crisp, and sterile. It smelled like polished steel and old money. I signed the access log, handed over my gold key, and watched as the vault custodian simultaneously turned his master key in the lock. The heavy metal door of box 402 clicked open. I pulled the long rectangular container out, carried it into a private viewing room, and locked the door behind me. I sat down at the small oak table and opened the lid. Inside lay various personal items. My late husband's vintage watch, a small velvet box containing Sophie's first lost tooth. But beneath those sentimental treasures was a thick manila envelope bound with a red string. I unspooled the string and slid the heavy stack of legal documents onto the table. The embossed seal of the state of Illinois caught the harsh overhead light. I spread the papers out, my eyes scanning the familiar legal jargon I had drafted half a decade ago. Looking at these documents always transported me back to that chaotic week 5 years ago. Back then, Thomas had made a series of disastrous stock investments, draining their retirement accounts to cover Brenda's escalating credit card debts and luxury car leases. They were bleeding cash, and the bank finally lost patience. A notice of default had been issued. The sprawling Tudor estate, the very foundation of Brenda's social identity, was scheduled for a public foreclosure auction. They were 2 weeks away from being physically locked out by the county sheriff. Thomas came to me in secret, weeping in my living room, begging for a bailout, while Brenda remained blissfully in denial, planning a lavish garden party. It was pathetic and infuriating to watch them unravel so completely. I knew that handing them cash would be like pouring water into a sinking ship. So I did what I do best. I restructured the asset. I retained a discreet corporate attorney and registered an anonymous holding company called Vanguard Properties, LLC. Using the life insurance money my husband left me and my own aggressive investments, Vanguard purchased the distressed debt directly from their bank for cash. I paid off the entire mortgage balance, effectively stopping the foreclosure auction dead in its tracks. But I did not put the house back in their names. I transferred the master deed directly to my LLC. I picked up the heavy, watermarked master deed and ran my fingers over the raised notary stamp. It clearly stated Vanguard Properties, LLC as the sole legal owner of the estate. Brenda and Thomas had no equity. They had no ownership rights. To keep them from ending up on the street, I had my lawyer draft a highly restrictive, ironclad lease agreement. I pulled that document out next. There were their signatures at the bottom. They had agreed to become month-to-month tenants of Vanguard Properties, LLC. The rent was set at exactly $1 per month, paid annually strictly to maintain the legal validity of the landlord and tenant relationship. The contract contained a strict non-disclosure clause. They were never allowed to reveal the arrangement, and I never rubbed it in their faces. I simply let Brenda continue living her fantasy, playing the wealthy matriarch, as long as she left me alone. But now she had broken the fundamental rule of our silent arrangement. She had foolishly tried to leverage my private asset. It was time to execute my next legal maneuver and expose her massive fraud to the bank before the loan was approved. I carefully placed the heavy stack of documents back into the manila envelope, tied the red string, and left the bank vault. The bustling financial district above ground felt entirely detached from the cold, calculated reality I had just confirmed below. I walked back to my SUV, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. The ambient noise of the Chicago traffic was muffled by the thick glass of my vehicle, creating a quiet cocoon where I could think clearly. The engine remained off. I set the envelope on the passenger seat and just stared at it, letting the sheer magnitude of my mother's arrogance wash over me. The analyst in me took over, compartmentalizing the emotional betrayal and focusing entirely on the logistical facts. I needed to map out the exact mechanics of their crime to secure a $500,000 home equity line of credit. Brenda and Courtney could not simply walk into a bank branch and smile at a loan officer. Modern banking underwriting is a ruthless, data-driven machine. The bank would require a comprehensive title search to ensure the collateral was unencumbered and legally owned by the applicant. When that title search occurred, the bank would immediately see Vanguard Properties, LLC, listed as the sole legal entity holding the deed. For the application to proceed to the funding stage, Brenda had to be actively fabricating an extensive paper trail. She was either forging a fake deed transfer to move the property from Vanguard back into her own name, or she was forging my signature as the managing member of the LLC to authorize the lien. She would have to produce fraudulent operating agreements, fake board resolutions, and a fabricated chain of title. The sheer audacity required to sit in front of a loan officer and lie about owning a multi-million-dollar estate was staggering. But it perfectly aligned with Brenda's lifelong belief that the rules simply did not apply to her. She believed her own fabricated reality so deeply that she thought the federal financial system would simply bow to her will. Both options required a fraudulent notary stamp, falsified federal tax identification numbers, and a deliberate intent to deceive a federally insured financial institution. This was no longer a petty family dispute over a dinner invitation. It was not just about Brenda being a narcissist or Courtney being an entitled brat. By filling out those loan documents to fund Jamal's non-existent tech startup, they had crossed the line into federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The penalties for these crimes were not a slap on the wrist or an awkward silence at the next Thanksgiving dinner. The penalties were decades in federal prison. Jamal, with his arrogant boasting, was likely listed as a co-borrower to access the funds for his business, completely implicating himself in a criminal conspiracy. The wealthy Atlanta investors they were trying so desperately to impress would run for the hills the second a federal investigator issued a subpoena. A cold shiver of pure adrenaline ran down my spine. The conflict had officially evolved into a high-stakes legal trap. I held the master key to that trap, and they were sprinting blindly toward the trigger. If I warned them now, they would simply withdraw the application, play the victim, and find another way to manipulate their way out of ruin. I could not let that happen. To truly protect my daughter and permanently sever this toxic tie, I needed them to commit fully. I needed the fraud to be a matter of official bank record. I reached into my purse, pulled out my cell phone, and scrolled through my professional contacts. I tapped the name of Brian, a senior title officer at a prominent national escrow firm. Brian and I had closed over $40 million in complex commercial transactions together. He knew I did not make requests lightly. He picked up on the second ring. Madeline, he answered, his voice bright and professional. What can I do for my favorite commercial analyst today? Brian, I need a personal favor, and it requires absolute discretion, I said, leaning back against the leather headrest. I need you to place a hard monitor on a specific residential parcel ID in the northern suburbs. He sensed the seriousness in my tone immediately. Give me the parcel number. I read the 10-digit code aloud. Vanguard Properties, LLC, is the legal owner. I continued. I suspect unauthorized individuals are attempting to use the asset as collateral for a large home equity line of credit. I need to know the second any financial institution pulls the title or attempts to record a lien against that property. I heard the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Consider it done, Madeline. I am setting up an automated alert system linked directly to the county recorder database. If anyone breathes on that title, we will get an instant notification. Thank you, Brian, I said. I ended the call and started the engine. The trap was armed. Tuesday afternoon arrived with a deceptive sense of quiet normalcy. After planting the tripwire with my contact at the title company, I had thrown myself completely back into my commercial real estate portfolios. I was sitting at my glass desk, meticulously reviewing a complex zoning variance for a new downtown high-rise, enjoying the predictable logic of municipal codes, when the sharp ring of my personal cell phone abruptly broke my concentration. The caller ID on the bright screen flashed the main office number for Oak Creek Elementary Sophie's School. A sudden cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. The elementary school only called parents during peak business hours if a child was sick or had been injured on the playground. I snatched the phone off the desk, answering it before the second ring could even finish. This is Madeline, I said firmly, bracing myself for bad news about my daughter. Hi, Madeline. This is Mrs. Gable from the front office, the school secretary said. Her voice was hushed and heavily laced with an uncomfortable, nervous tension. I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt your workday, but we have a bit of an unusual situation unfolding right now here in the front lobby. Is Sophie all right? I asked sharply, already standing up from my ergonomic chair and reaching for my tailored trench coat on the rack. Sophie is perfectly fine, Mrs. Gable assured me quickly, anticipating my maternal panic. She is safe and sitting right here behind my desk, but your mother Brenda is currently standing in the reception area. She came in completely unannounced and is aggressively insisting on signing Sophie out of school early today. She is claiming to the staff that there is a sudden family emergency requiring her immediate presence, but she is standing there carrying several large, brightly colored shopping bags from the American Girl store and a high-end children's boutique. Sophie seemed very hesitant when she saw her grandmother, and specifically asked me to call you before she went anywhere with her. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the maneuver made my blood run entirely cold. Brenda was panicking. Thomas had clearly reported back to her that I was absolutely not backing down, and that I was completely immune to his tired, emotional blackmail. With the massive financial threat of the wealthy Atlanta investors pulling their seed funding looming directly over her head, her carefully constructed narrative of the perfect united family was rapidly collapsing. Because she realized she could no longer manipulate me directly, she had decided to bypass my parental authority entirely and go straight for the most vulnerable target available. She was trying to ambush and bribe my 10-year-old daughter into compliance. Mrs. Gable. Please listen to me very carefully, I said, my voice dropping into a hard, commanding register that I usually reserved for hostile boardroom negotiations. You are not to release my daughter to her grandmother under any circumstances today. Keep Sophie securely behind the administrative desk. Do not let Brenda approach her or speak to her alone. Of course, Madeline, Mrs. Gable replied, sounding incredibly relieved to have clear authoritative instructions. I must warn you she is becoming quite loud and demanding with the reception staff, though. I am leaving my corporate office right now. I told her already, power walking down the long hallway toward the express elevator bank. I will be at the school in exactly 15 minutes. If she tries to cause a scene, elevate her voice at the staff, or force her way past the front counter, I want you to call the school resource officer immediately and have her removed from the building. I hung up the phone and sprinted to the underground parking garage. The drive from downtown Chicago to the affluent, quiet suburb of Oak Creek usually took 25 minutes in good conditions, but I made it in 15, weaving aggressively and efficiently through the thick afternoon traffic. My grip on the leather steering wheel was tight enough to turn my knuckles stark white. Brenda had crossed a massive, unforgivable line today. Using calculated psychological manipulation on an adult was one thing, but attempting to ambush and bribe a young child at her elementary school just to serve a desperate narcissistic agenda was entirely different. I whipped my heavy SUV into the school parking lot. I immediately spotted Brenda's pristine silver-leased Mercedes-Benz. True to her entitled form, she had completely ignored the dozen empty visitor parking spots and parked her luxury vehicle diagonally across the yellow curb of the emergency fire lane, acting as if the standard rules of basic civil society simply did not apply to her. I threw my car into park, slammed the heavy door behind me, and marched purposefully toward the main glass entrance, fully ready to permanently shut down her delusional theater. She thought she could use expensive toys to erase the cruelty she had inflicted just 2 days prior. She thought Sophie was just another pawn to be bought and positioned on her chessboard. I pushed open the double doors, stepping directly into the chaotic school lobby. The main office of Oak Creek Elementary was usually a place of quiet administration. As I stepped through the glass doors, the tension was suffocating. My mother stood dead center in the lobby, wearing a white cashmere coat that looked out of place amidst the bulletin boards. She clutched 3 glossy shopping bags from high-end retailers. Behind the reception desk, Mrs. Gable looked pale. Sitting on a plastic chair out of Brenda's reach was my daughter. Sophie looked terrified, her backpack clutched to her chest. The moment Sophie saw me, her shoulders dropped in pure relief. "Madeline, darling," Brenda announced loudly, her voice echoing off the linoleum. She plastered on a theatrical smile, pivoting to face me with arms spread wide. "I was just telling the lovely secretary here that we had a tiny family surprise, really. I came to whisk my granddaughter away for an afternoon shopping spree. Look what I brought her." Brenda rustled the expensive bags, making sure everyone in the office noticed the designer logos. She was playing to an audience, weaponizing social pressure to force my compliance. I ignored her entirely. I walked past her cashmere coat, keeping my eyes on my daughter. I crouched down in front of Sophie, placing my hands on her knees. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Yes, Mom," Sophie whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward Brenda. "I told her I did not want to leave school early. I told her I wanted to wait for you." "You did exactly the right thing," I told her, offering a reassuring nod. "You are safe. Stay right here with Mrs. Gable." I stood up and finally turned to face my mother. The artificial smile on Brenda's face was beginning to slip as she realized her performance was failing. "Madeline, do not be difficult," Brenda hissed, dropping her volume but increasing the venom in her tone. "I am trying to do something nice for the child. You are embarrassing yourself by acting like a paranoid lunatic in front of the staff. Just sign her out so we can go. We have things to discuss about this weekend." I did not argue. I did not justify my parenting or bring up the horrific way she had treated Sophie just 48 hours prior. I simply looked past her shoulder toward the hallway. Standing near the cafeteria entrance was Officer Ramirez, the school resource officer. He was an imposing man in full uniform who had been observing the escalating situation. I raised my hand, catching his eye, gesturing for him to come over. "What are you doing?" Brenda snapped, her eyes widening as the armed police officer began walking toward us. "I am enforcing a boundary," I replied coldly. Officer Ramirez approached the reception desk, resting a hand on his utility belt. "Is everything all right here, Mrs. Gable?" he asked, his authoritative voice commanding the room. I stepped forward before the flustered secretary could answer. "Officer, my name is Madeline, and this is my daughter Sophie. This woman is Brenda, my mother. She does not have legal custody or educational rights regarding my child. Effective immediately, I am formally revoking any emergency contact authorization she may have on file." Brenda let out a sharp, offended gasp. "Madeline, how dare you?" I kept my eyes locked on the officer. She showed up today unannounced and attempted to coerce my daughter into leaving against her will. I want it officially documented that she is no longer permitted on school property to contact my child. If she returns, I want her cited for trespassing. Officer Ramirez nodded slowly, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Understood. Mrs. Gable, please update the emergency file right now." "Ma'am," he said, turning his stern gaze directly onto Brenda, "you need to gather your belongings and exit the building immediately. You are no longer authorized to be here." Brenda looked around the lobby in pure shock. The other parents were openly staring at her. For a woman whose entire existence revolved around social superiority and public perception, this was the ultimate degradation. Being publicly reprimanded by law enforcement in an elementary school was a stain she could not spin. Her face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. She looked at me with pure hatred. "You will regret this, Madeline," she whispered, trembling with rage. "You are destroying this family." I did not blink. "The exit is behind you, Brenda." She spun around, her cashmere coat swishing dramatically. She marched toward the glass doors, her designer heels clicking furiously against the linoleum floor. The sharp, rapid sound echoed down the hallway, fading only when the heavy doors slammed shut behind her. I stood firmly in the quiet lobby, knowing she had just played her last desperate card. I stood firmly in this quiet lobby, knowing she had just played her last desperate card. Or so I thought. I severely underestimated the depths of their vindictiveness. I thanked Officer Ramirez and signed Sophie out. We walked to my vehicle in silence. We drove home, ordered takeout, and spent the evening watching movies. I wanted to create absolute peace for her. Once Sophie was fast asleep, I went downstairs to pour myself a glass of Cabernet. I set my phone on the kitchen counter, expecting the usual barrage of angry text messages from my father. Instead, the screen lit up with a completely different kind of notification. It was a flood of alerts from Facebook and Instagram. My social media accounts, which I rarely used, were suddenly exploding with tags, direct messages, and comment notifications from neighbors, country club members, and casual acquaintances. I tapped the Instagram icon and saw Courtney tagged me in a 10-minute video. The thumbnail showed Courtney looking exhausted and tearful on her plush white sofa. I pressed play. It was a masterclass in performative victimhood. Courtney wore an oversized beige sweater, her flawless hair in a messy bun, using minimal makeup to emphasize her red, seemingly swollen eyes. "I did not want to bring this to social media," Courtney began, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed fragility. "But my family is going through an agonizing crisis right now, and I feel I have to speak my truth before the rumors spread any further." She took a deep, shaky breath, wiping a non-existent tear from her cheek. "My sister Madeline is suffering from a severe mental health breakdown. Ever since her husband passed away, she has been spiraling, and today things reached a terrifying breaking point. She completely snapped and caused a horrific scene at my niece's elementary school, using armed police officers to publicly humiliate our mother." I took a sip of my wine, watching my sister weave a tapestry of absolute fiction. Courtney stared directly into the camera, her hands clasped together in fake prayer. "Our mother Brenda is the most loving, devoted grandmother in the world. She just wanted to drop off some gifts for Sophie. But Madeline is actively isolating her child, using her as a weapon to punish our family because she is hurting. It is textbook parental alienation. My parents are absolutely devastated. They are terrified for Sophie's safety in that house. Then came the pivot. Courtney shifted the narrative to center herself as she always did. I know Madeline is struggling with her grief. Courtney sighed, looking down sorrowfully. And I know it is hard for her to look at me and Jamal. We have a beautiful, successful marriage. Jamal's tech startup is about to close a massive seed funding round with our family investors from Atlanta. We are building a legacy. I think my sister is just drowning in jealousy and bitterness, and she is trying to destroy our joy because she cannot find her own. I scrolled down to the comment section. The video had only been live for an hour, but it already had hundreds of comments from the affluent residents of Oak Creek. The wealthy suburban housewives, the parent-teacher association board members, and the country club elite were eating it up. Praying for your family, Courtney, one neighbor wrote. Madeline always seemed so cold and unhinged, a woman from the country club added. Brenda is an angel. I cannot believe she was treated like a criminal. Another chimed in. The community was rallying around the golden child, eager to participate in the public crucifixion of the grieving widow. The sheer manipulation was breathtaking. Courtney had successfully weaponized the death of my husband and my protective actions at the school to paint me as an unstable, jealous villain. She was trying to publicly shame me into submission, hoping the social pressure from our elite community would force me to apologize and attend the gala to save face. But Courtney had made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed I cared about the opinions of people I fundamentally despised. She assumed I would jump into the comment section screaming defensively, making myself look exactly as unhinged as she claimed. I did not type a single word in response. I did not report the video or block her account. I took a screenshot of the video capturing the timestamp and her defamatory claims, and forwarded it directly to my attorney's email address for our growing legal file. Let her broadcast her lies to the entire town. Let the community shower her with sympathy. The higher she climbed on her pedestal of public martyrdom, the more devastating her fall was going to be when the bank fraud investigators finally knocked on her door. The next morning, I woke up feeling remarkably well rested. I went through my normal routine, got Sophie ready for school, and dropped her off with a reassuring hug. Officer Ramirez gave me a subtle nod from the crosswalk, silently confirming that Brenda would not be making another surprise appearance. After leaving the school drop-off lane, I decided to stop by the Roasted Bean, an upscale artisanal coffee shop in the heart of the Oak Creek Town Square. It was my usual Wednesday ritual before heading into the city for another demanding day of analyzing properties. The moment I pushed open the heavy glass door, the gentle hum of morning gossip abruptly died. The bell above the door chimed, and practically every head in the cafe turned to look at me. The affluent mothers in their expensive yoga pants returning from their morning Pilates classes, and the retired executives reading their morning papers all stared. Some immediately averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply fascinated by the intricate foam art on their lattes. Others glared openly, their expressions twisting with blatant disapproval and poorly concealed disgust. Courtney's tearful, highly edited video had clearly made its rounds through the local social ecosystem. I was no longer just the quiet widow who worked in commercial real estate. I was the unhinged daughter who was aggressively keeping a sweet, loving grandmother away from her grandchild. I walked up to the counter, ignoring the heavy blanket of judgment suffocating the room. The young barista, a college student who usually greeted me with a bright smile and asked about my day, refused to make eye contact. She stared rigidly at the cash register screen. "Good morning," I said pleasantly. "I will have my usual double espresso, please." She punched the order into the screen with unnecessary force. "That will be $4.50, she mumbled, taking my card without looking up. I paid left a generous tip and moved to the pickup counter. I could hear the aggressive whispering behind me. I heard the words "mental breakdown," and poor Brenda hissed between the tables. I did not flinch. I picked up my ceramic espresso cup and found a small table near the window. I sat down, crossed my legs, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast was bitter and perfect. I had barely set my cup down when a shadow fell across my table. It was Pamela, the president of the local homeowner association and one of Brenda's closest country club friends. She was a woman who thrived on suburban drama, wielding fake concern like a weapon. Madeline, Pamela said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she hovered over my table. We were all so shocked to see Courtney's video last night. It is just heartbreaking. Grief can do terrible things to a person's mind. If you ever need someone to talk to, or if you need a recommendation for a good therapist, the community is here for you. You really should not be pushing your family away during a mental health crisis. It is not healthy for little Sophie. She stood there waiting for me to snap. She wanted me to raise my voice to defend myself, to prove Courtney right in front of an audience of eager spectators. She wanted a scene she could report straight back to Brenda. I looked up at Pamela. I did not glare or frown. I simply looked at her with the blank, calculating expression I used when evaluating a severely overvalued property. I let the silence stretch for 5 seconds, then 10. Pamela shifted her weight, her fake smile faltering under my unblinking gaze. I picked up my espresso, took another slow sip, and looked back out the window at the morning traffic. I did not say a single word. Pamela let out a huff of deep offense, muttered something about me being impossible to help, and marched back to her table of gossiping friends. I smiled against the rim of my cup. My silence was infuriating to them, but it was my absolute shield. I refused to litigate my sanity or my parenting in the court of local opinion. As I finished my espresso, my cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden table. It was not a social media notification. It was a secure text message from Brian, my contact at the National Title Company. I unlocked the screen. The message was brief, professional, and utterly devastating. Madeline, the alert just triggered. A formal loan application for exactly $500,000 has just been submitted to First Sterling Bank. The applicant listed the Vanguard property as primary collateral. An automated title pull is in the queue. They are moving forward. I locked the phone and slid it securely into my leather purse. The trap had officially snapped shut today. Brenda and Courtney had blindly crossed the point of no return. They were no longer just planning a financial fraud in secret. They had actually executed it. The irreversible federal paper trail now existed forever, stamped with their forged signatures and desperate lies. The absolute countdown to their total destruction had begun, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it from tearing their perfect facade apart. I left the coffee shop and drove straight back to my house. The crisp morning air felt invigorating now, completely untainted by the judgment of the local gossips. I walked through my front door, tossed my keys onto the entryway table, and headed directly into my home office. Unlike the rest of the house, which was decorated with warm colors and Sophie's artwork, my office was a sterile, highly organized sanctuary. 3 large monitors sat on a heavy oak desk surrounded by neatly stacked legal pads and architectural blueprints. It was a room built for executing calculated decisions, a sharp contrast to the emotional chaos my family constantly tried to drag me into. I sat down in my leather chair, woke up my computer, and opened a secure browser window. First Sterling Bank was a prominent regional lender known for handling substantial commercial and high-net-worth residential loans. I did not bother looking up their general customer service hotline. Calling the toll-free number would only connect me to a low-level representative reading from a scripted prompt, and I did not have the patience to be placed on hold while some entry-level employee tried to understand the complexities of corporate title structures. Instead, I accessed a private financial directory I used for my commercial real estate work. I quickly located the direct phone number for the First Sterling Bank Risk Management and Commercial Fraud Division. I picked up my phone and dialed the unlisted number. It rang only twice before a deep, serious voice answered. First Sterling Enterprise Risk and Fraud Division. This is Agent Miller, the man said. Good morning, Agent Miller, I replied, my voice slipping effortlessly into its professional, authoritative cadence. My name is Madeline. I am a senior cash flow analyst specializing in commercial real estate acquisitions, and I am the sole managing member of Vanguard Properties, LLC. I am calling to report an active high-level fraudulent loan application currently processing through your underwriting department. The tone on the other end of the line shifted immediately from routine to highly alert. I have my terminal open. Madeline Agent Miller said, the sound of rapid typing echoing through the receiver. Give me the property parcel number or the applicant name. The primary applicant is likely listed as Jamal or Courtney, with Brenda, potentially listed as a cosigner, or the supposed property owner, I explained clinically. They have submitted an application this morning for a $500,000 home equity line of credit. The collateral they offered is a residential estate. I read him the 10-digit county parcel identification number. The typing stopped for a brief second, then resumed with intense speed. I see the application in our queue. Agent Miller confirmed, his voice tightening. It was submitted online less than 2 hours ago. The requested amount is indeed $500,000. What exactly is the nature of the fraud you are reporting? The applicants do not own the collateral, I stated bluntly. Vanguard Properties, LLC, holds the exclusive master deed to that estate. There are no secondary liens, and we have not authorized any borrowing against our equity. If Brenda or Courtney submitted documentation claiming ownership, they have fabricated a deed transfer and forged my signature as the corporate entity manager. There was a heavy loaded silence on the line. In the banking industry, there is a massive difference between a simple credit card dispute and $500,000 of federal mortgage fraud. Can you verify your identity and your connection to Vanguard Properties, LLC? He asked, his tone now completely strictly business. I gave him my corporate tax identification number, my federal employer identification number, and the contact information for the law firm that handled my corporate filings. Within 60 seconds, Agent Miller was able to cross-reference my credentials with the state registry. Your credentials check out, Madeline, Agent Miller said. The gravity in his voice told me everything I needed to know. I am looking at the preliminary digital documents they uploaded with the application. There is a warranty deed here claiming Vanguard Properties transferred ownership back to Brenda last month. It includes a digital notary stamp. It is completely forged, I replied without hesitation. I can have my corporate attorney send over the genuine master deed and our operating agreement within the hour. That will not be necessary just yet, Agent Miller said. I am placing an immediate hard freeze on this application. It will not move forward to funding under any circumstances. We will initiate our own internal title pull and send the uploaded documents to our forensic department to verify the forged notary stamp. If this is a fabricated warranty deed, this immediately escalates to a federal matter involving wire fraud. I understand perfectly, I said. I appreciate your swift action, Agent Miller. I will be in touch, he replied, and the line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to my desk. The trap was no longer just set. The lock had been turned from the outside, and the key had been thrown away. Brenda and Jamal were now sitting in the crosshairs of a federal bank investigator, completely oblivious to the fact that their financial execution was already in motion. I remained at my desk, staring at the muted monitors while the silence of my home office settled around me. Less than 10 minutes after my conversation with Agent Miller ended, a secure encrypted email arrived in my corporate inbox. The sender address belonged to the bank's fraud division. I carefully clicked the link, thoroughly authenticated my personal identity through their secure portal, and downloaded the massive attached PDF file. It was a complete digital copy of the home equity line of credit application package that Courtney and Jamal had submitted just hours earlier. I did not want to review something of this magnitude on a screen. I needed to hold the physical evidence in my hands to feel the weight of their profound arrogance. I quickly sent the 120-page document to my laser printer. The heavy machine whirred to life, methodically churning out page after page of financial ruin. While it printed, I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a fresh glass of ice water, and brought it back to the desk. I pulled a bright yellow highlighter and a red pen from my drawer, laying them out with the surgical precision of an analyst preparing to dissect a toxic asset. I grabbed the thick stack of warm paper from the printer tray and dropped it squarely onto my desk. The first section contained the standard loan application forms. I skimmed through the personal information highlighting the blatant lies. Jamal had listed his annual income as $300,000, a laughable fabrication for a man whose tech startup possessed absolutely zero revenue and existed entirely on a colorful pitch deck. Courtney was listed as the co-applicant, claiming employment as a marketing director for Jamal's non-existent company. They had checked the box affirming that all provided information was true and accurate, under penalty of perjury. My red pen slashed through their fabricated financials. It was pathetic, but inflating income on a loan application was a relatively common offense. The bank would have likely rejected them based on their terrible debt-to-income ratio alone once the underwriting process began. However, my family had not stopped at simple financial exaggeration. They had gone for the nuclear option. I flipped past the credit disclosures and reached the collateral documentation section. This was the exact point where their petty entitlement metastasized into a severe federal crime. Staring back at me on page 42 was a beautifully fabricated warranty deed. It was dated just 3 weeks prior. The document explicitly claimed that Vanguard Properties, LLC, had legally transferred the master deed of the estate back into Brenda's name as an outright gift. I ran my fingers over the printed page. At the bottom of the fraudulent transfer document was a signature line designated for the managing member of the LLC. Right there in blue ink that had been scanned into the system was my name. Brenda had actually attempted to forge my signature. It was a sloppy imitation, lacking the sharp angular loops I naturally used, but it was clear enough to pass a casual glance by an overworked loan processor. Below my forged signature was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. It was a digital notary stamp complete with a license number and a signature from a notary public claiming to have witnessed me sign the document in person. Brenda had not just practiced signing my name, she had actively conspired with a corrupt notary, or she had somehow acquired a fake stamp to legitimize her stolen equity. I sat back in my chair, the yellow highlighter hovering over the page. Absolute clarity washed over me. For years I had analyzed my mother as a toxic narcissist, a woman who manipulated emotions to maintain her iron grip on the family dynamic. But looking at the fraudulent notary stamp and my forged signature, I realized I had fundamentally misunderstood the depth of her depravity. She was not just a terrible mother. She was a criminal. By submitting this fabricated deed to a federally insured bank to secure a massive line of credit, Brenda Courtney and Jamal had committed wire fraud, identity theft, and severe bank fraud. They were no longer playing high society games at the country club. They had brazenly walked into a federal jurisdiction where the penalty was mandatory prison time, not just social embarrassment. I capped my highlighter and placed it down. The emotional wounds of my childhood, the sting of Sophie being excluded from the birthday gala, all of it faded away, replaced by the cold hard mechanics of the law. I picked up the forged deed, folded it neatly into a new file folder, and began to map out the legal steps required to strike the absolute final blow against them. I left the sterile environment of my home office and walked into the kitchen. The adrenaline spike from discovering the felony had passed, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. I opened my wine fridge and selected a bottle of Pinot Noir. I poured myself a generous glass, watching the dark ruby liquid fill the crystal goblet. I took a slow sip, letting the complex flavors ground me. The time for emotional reactions was entirely over. I was now operating strictly within the parameters of asset protection and legal retaliation. My parents had chosen to cross the line from emotional abuse into federal crime, and I was going to respond with the full, devastating weight of the law. I carried my wineglass back to the desk, picked up my cell phone, and dialed Jonathan. He was the ruthless, highly effective corporate attorney who had helped me establish Vanguard Properties, LLC, half a decade ago. Jonathan was expensive, brilliant, and completely devoid of sentimentality when it came to contract law. He answered on the second ring, recognizing my private number. Good evening, Madeline, Jonathan said, his voice crisp and alert despite the late hour. To what do I owe the pleasure of an after-hours call? We have a critical breach of lease regarding the Oak Creek estate, I stated, skipping the pleasantries. My mother and my sister just submitted a fraudulent application for a $500,000 line of credit to First Sterling Bank. They included a fabricated warranty deed, attempting to transfer the title from Vanguard back to my mother, complete with a forged signature and a fake digital notary stamp. Jonathan let out a low, sharp whistle over the line. That is an incredibly bold maneuver, he said, his legal mind already dissecting the liability. Have you contacted the bank? I already spoke directly with their commercial fraud division, I confirmed. The underwriter placed a hard freeze on the application. The funds will never be released. But stopping the loan is only the first step. I am calling you because I am ready to liquidate the toxic asset. I want to terminate their tenancy immediately. Jonathan paused, the sound of a keyboard clacking gently in the background as he pulled up the Vanguard file. According to the master lease agreement they signed 5 years ago, they are classified as month-to-month tenants. Section 8 explicitly forbids any illegal activities on the premises. Committing federal mortgage fraud using the property as the focal point of the crime is a massive, indisputable material breach of contract. We do not need to give them a standard warning or a chance to correct the violation. We can proceed straight to eviction. Exactly, I said, taking another sip of my wine. I want you to draft a formal, legally binding 30-day notice to quit. I want the language to be absolutely merciless. Clearly cite the breach of lease. State explicitly that the eviction is due to the fraudulent misrepresentation of ownership and the active commission of felony bank fraud. Leave zero room for interpretation. They need to know that their criminal actions are the direct and sole cause of their immediate displacement. Consider it done, Jonathan replied, his tone shifting into pure professional execution. I will ensure the citations reference the specific state statutes regarding lease termination due to criminal behavior. They will have exactly 30 calendar days from the moment of service to vacate the property entirely. If they fail to comply, we will file the formal unlawful detainer lawsuit and have the county sheriff physically remove them and their belongings. There is one more crucial detail, Jonathan, I added, setting my wine glass down and leaning forward. This cannot look like a standard piece of mail. I need the presentation to reflect the absolute severity of the document. I want this eviction notice printed on the heaviest, most intimidating watermarked legal paper your firm possesses. Use a bold red font for the header. Make it look like a definitive legal strike. Jonathan chuckled softly. You want it to make a statement. I am having it hand-delivered to her right in the middle of her lavish 60th birthday gala. This Saturday night, I explained, a cold smile forming on my lips. She is hosting 100 wealthy guests and wealthy investors from Atlanta to celebrate her fake legacy. I want the eviction notice to be undeniable. That is a brilliant tactical move, Madeline, Jonathan said with genuine respect. A public serving prevents them from hiding the document or playing the victim behind closed doors. I will personally draft the notice tonight. I will have it printed on our premium embossed bond paper and couriered directly to your house by tomorrow afternoon. Thank you, Jonathan, I said. I ended the call and looked back at the forged loan documents scattered across my desk. The legal snare was now perfectly woven. Saturday night arrived with a chilling autumn breeze, but inside the Oak Creek estate, the atmosphere was entirely artificial and suffocatingly warm. The sweeping driveway was lined with imported luxury vehicles, guided by valet attendants Brenda had hired using yet another maxed-out credit card. The grand Tudor house, the property she falsely claimed to own, was illuminated by dozens of theatrical spotlights casting dramatic shadows against the brick facade. It looked less like a home and more like a movie set designed for a production that was secretly completely out of funding. Stepping through the heavy oak double doors, the foyer had been transformed into an absurd display of fake wealth. A massive, intricately carved ice sculpture of a swan dominated the center table, slowly melting onto a bed of imported orchids. The delicate classical melodies of a live 12-piece string quartet drifted from the living room, struggling to be heard over the loud, performative chatter of the local country club elite. Waiters dressed in crisp white tuxedos circulated smoothly through the busy crowd, balancing heavy silver trays loaded with expensive caviar and flutes of vintage champagne that Brenda had absolutely no way of actually paying for. It was a masterpiece of financial delusion. At the very center of this manufactured grandeur stood my mother. Brenda was holding court near the grand fireplace, completely ignoring the massive legal avalanche heading straight for her. She was wearing an absurdly expensive floor-length silver sequined gown that caught the light with every slight movement, making her look like a walking chandelier. Her hair was professionally styled into a stiff, unnatural updo, and her neck was draped in heavy diamonds that I knew for a fact were rented for the occasion. She laughed loudly at a polite joke made by a visiting city councilman, tossing her head back with practiced elegance. To the untrained eye, she was the undisputed queen of Oak Creek, radiating an aura of generational wealth and untouchable social status. But beneath the heavy layer of expensive foundation, the tension in her jaw was visible. She kept glancing nervously toward the main entrance, constantly checking the time on her diamond-encrusted watch. Across the room, Courtney was diligently playing the role of the perfect supportive hostess. She wore a sleek emerald green cocktail dress, aggressively networking with the local business owners, trying to drop Jamal's name into every single conversation. She would casually mention his tech startup, throwing around buzzwords she barely understood, acting as if they were already billionaires, simply waiting for the paperwork to clear. Jamal stood beside her, sipping a neat scotch and pretending to look bored by the provincial wealth of our suburb. He projected the carefully curated image of a tech visionary, waiting for his real peers to arrive, checking his phone with feigned impatience. They were a matching pair of frauds entirely dependent on the illusion Brenda was currently funding with stolen equity. But the true barometer of the evening was my father Thomas. He was not mingling with the guests. He was not laughing at polite jokes. Thomas had anchored himself securely to the far end of the mahogany wet bar, his third double bourbon already halfway gone. His tuxedo looked a size too small, emphasizing the rigid tension in his shoulders, and his face was slick with a thin layer of anxious sweat. While Brenda and Courtney lived completely inside their fantasy world, Thomas was the only one acutely aware of the terrifying reality hanging over their heads. He knew the $500,000 line of credit was pending. He knew the Atlanta investors had the ultimate power to make or break them tonight. And he knew deep down that my absolute refusal to attend was a glaring, gaping hole in their carefully constructed facade of a perfect united family. The large antique grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed loudly, clearly signaling exactly 8 o'clock. The party was in full swing, but the true guests of honor, the wealthy logistics moguls from Atlanta, had not yet arrived. The local guests were merely the opening act, the necessary props Brenda needed to properly set the stage. The real high-stakes performance could not begin until Jamal's family finally walked through those heavy double doors. Every time a new car pulled up the sweeping driveway, Brenda's eyes darted aggressively toward the foyer, her fake smile tightening just a fraction of an inch. She adjusted her rented diamonds, smoothed her sequined gown, and signaled a waiter for another long gulp of vintage champagne. The entire house felt like a tightly coiled spring ready to violently snap at the slightest provocation. They had built a towering castle made entirely of stolen cards, completely unaware that I had already legally removed the foundation. The heavy oak doors swung open. The dull roar of the party dipped as a formidable trio stepped into the foyer. It was Jamal's family, the Atlanta investors. His father Gregory led the pack. Gregory was a towering, imposing man who had built a massive regional logistics empire from a single delivery truck. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal pinstripe suit, carrying an intimidating aura of ruthless pragmatism that clashed heavily with the artificial champagne-soaked frivolity of Brenda's birthday gala. Beside him stood his wife Beatrice, exuding quiet, understated elegance, and his younger brother, a corporate tax attorney who served as the chief financial officer of their logistics firm. They did not look like ordinary guests arriving for a joyous celebration. They looked like an executive board arriving for a hostile takeover audit. Jamal practically sprinted across the foyer to greet them, his detached tech visionary persona evaporating into eagerness. He embraced his father, but Gregory kept his posture rigid, his sharp eyes scanning the intricate molding, the sweeping staircase, and the sheer scale of the Tudor estate. He was definitely not admiring the lavish Tudor architecture. He was running a mental appraisal. Gregory bypassed the small talk entirely, his deep, resonant voice cutting through the classical music drifting from the living room. Impressive square footage, Jamal, Gregory noted, tapping his wooden cane lightly against the marble floor. Good bone structure. What is the acreage on a parcel like this in Oak Creek? The property taxes alone must be astronomical. Before Jamal could formulate a response, Brenda swooped in like a bird of prey. She glided across the marble, her silver sequined gown flashing under the chandelier, an aggressive smile plastered across her face. "Gregory, Beatrice, welcome to our family home," Brenda announced loudly, ensuring her voice carried to the surrounding guests. She extended her heavily jeweled hands, projecting matriarchal grace. "I am Brenda, the matriarch. We are absolutely thrilled you could fly up from Atlanta to celebrate with us tonight. As you can see, this estate has been the crown jewel of our family for quite some time. It is a place of deep legacy." Gregory shook her hand firmly, his expression unreadable. "It is a substantial asset, Brenda," he replied, skipping the complimentary pleasantries altogether. "Jamal tells me you are putting up the equity of this property to match our seed funding for his software venture. That is a highly aggressive financial maneuver for a residential family home." Brenda did not even blink. She laughed, a light, airy sound, completely devoid of anxiety, leaning into her fabricated reality with terrifying conviction. "Oh, Gregory, when you believe in your children, it is not aggressive. It is simply a necessary investment. Courtney and Jamal are the future of this family. We have more than enough built-up equity to fully guarantee their success. I am personally gifting them a $500,000 line of credit against the estate to match your contribution. The paperwork is already processing with our bank as we speak." Courtney nodded eagerly beside her mother, nervously, linking her thin arm tightly through Jamal's. "We just want to make sure Jamal has the runway he needs to completely disrupt the market," Courtney chimed in, using the tech buzzwords she had rehearsed all week. Gregory exchanged a brief, highly communicative glance with his brother, the tax attorney. The Atlanta contingent was visibly impressed by the sheer scale of the supposed collateral, but their inherent business caution remained firmly intact. $500,000 in liquid equity is a strong show of faith. Gregory conceded, his tone methodical. "I appreciate a family that puts its own skin in the game. It shows genuine commitment. However, before I sign over a matching check from my firm, my legal team will need to verify the title and the underwriting approvals. We do not engage in blind investments regardless of family ties." Thomas, who had silently drifted over from the wet bar, paled visibly at the mention of verifying the title. He clutched his empty bourbon glass, looking as though he might physically collapse onto the marble floor. His weak chest heaved with silent, deeply panicked breaths. But Brenda simply smiled wider, completely undisturbed by the threat of a legal audit. She genuinely believed her forged documents would hold up against federal scrutiny. "Of course, Gregory," Brenda purred, waving her hand dismissively. "Transparency is paramount. Our bank is finalizing the terms now. But tonight is strictly about celebrating our wonderful family. Please have some vintage champagne. Let us enjoy the evening before we dive into the tedious legal paperwork." Gregory nodded slowly, accepting a flute from a passing waiter, though his eyes remained sharp and calculating. The trap was fully baited, and Brenda had just proudly handed them the rope. Sensing that the initial introduction had successfully planted the seed of her immense wealth, Brenda decided it was time to elevate the performance. She signaled to the string quartet playing in the adjacent living room. The musicians immediately ceased playing their classical instruments, allowing a sudden, expectant hush to fall over the sprawling ground floor of the estate. Brenda stepped onto the slightly elevated landing of the grand, sweeping staircase, positioning herself perfectly beneath the cascading crystal chandelier. She retrieved a silver spoon from a nearby dessert tray and tapped it delicately against her champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound easily commanded the attention of the 100 affluent guests scattered throughout the first floor. "Gather around everyone, please," Brenda called out, her voice projecting with the practiced theatricality of a seasoned stage actress. "Come into the foyer. I want us all together for a moment." The sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos slowly converged into the grand entryway. The local country club elite pressed in close, murmuring in polite anticipation. Waiters quickly collected empty glasses and stepped back into the shadows. Jamal ushered his parents to the very front of the crowd, ensuring the Atlanta investors had an unobstructed view of the matriarch in her element. Courtney stood faithfully at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at our mother with manufactured adoration. Thomas remained entirely frozen at the wet bar in the distance, physically incapable of joining the cheerful congregation. He knew exactly what kind of colossal lie she was about to spin, and the sheer terror of impending discovery kept him anchored to his spot. Brenda waited until every single eye in the room was fixed squarely upon her silver sequined figure. She smiled warmly, clasping her heavily jeweled hands together over her chest in a gesture of profound manufactured gratitude. "When I look around this magnificent room tonight, I do not just see friends or business associates." Brenda began, her voice dripping with artificial emotion. "I see a community. I see the people who understand the true meaning of legacy. This house, this beautiful estate standing strong around us, has been the absolute bedrock of our family for decades. It has sheltered our dreams, witnessed our greatest triumphs, and provided a steadfast foundation of security in an unpredictable world. But a house is merely bricks and mortar if you do not use it to elevate the people you love." She paused, allowing her words to echo off the high-vaulted ceilings. The crowd listened with rapt attention, completely captivated by her performance. "That is why tonight is not just about celebrating my 60th birthday." Brenda continued, her gaze sweeping grandly over the assembled guests, before locking directly onto Jamal and his wealthy parents. "Tonight is about passing the torch. It is about generosity. Thomas and I have been incredibly blessed, and true wealth is absolutely meaningless unless you use it to empower the next generation. That is why we are officially pledging the equity of this very estate to back Courtney and Jamal as they build their new technology venture. We believe in their brilliance, and we are putting the full weight of our family legacy behind them." The audience let out a collective murmur of approval. Several guests nodded in deep respect, entirely fooled by the image of the selfless, financially powerful matriarch. Jamal puffed out his chest, looking incredibly smug as he glanced sideways at his father, clearly taking credit for securing such a massive, unearned financial backing. Brenda let the admiration wash over her, feeding her narcissistic supply like oxygen. But she could not resist the urge to play the ultimate martyr. She needed the narrative to be absolutely flawless, which meant she had to address my glaring absence before anyone else could question it. Her bright smile faltered just a fraction, replaced by a perfectly calibrated look of maternal sorrow. She lowered her voice, injecting a slight trembling vulnerability into her tone. "Of course, building a family legacy is rarely a perfect journey." Brenda sighed, looking down momentarily at her diamond necklace. "Sometimes, despite our absolute best efforts and endless unconditional love, some family members lose their way. They allow grief or bitterness to blind them to the blessings right in front of them, and they choose to walk away from the table. It is heartbreaking, truly. But a mother's heart is a vast thing. No matter how deep the misunderstanding or how hurtful the distance, the door to this home is always open. That is what family means to me. Forgiveness, unwavering support, and keeping the light on for those who are struggling in the dark." The manipulation was absolute perfection. She had successfully weaponized my absence, painting herself as a tragically loving mother, endlessly forgiving a deeply troubled daughter. She had inoculated the crowd against any rumors they might have heard, reinforcing Courtney's earlier social media smear campaign. The foyer erupted into enthusiastic applause. Women in the front row pressed their hands to their hearts, genuinely moved by her fake display of grace. Men raised their champagne flutes in a toast to her supposed generosity. Courtney wiped a totally non-existent tear from her perfectly powdered cheek and led the clapping. Jamal stood tall, flashing a triumphant, arrogant grin. He thought he had officially secured his millions. He thought Brenda had seamlessly manipulated the Atlanta investors into total submission. Gregory politely clapped his hands, his expression remaining dangerously neutral as he observed the spectacle. Thomas just stared at the floor, gripping his empty glass so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Brenda beamed down at her adoring audience, raising her own glass in victory, fully believing she had just orchestrated the crowning achievement of her entire social life. She had absolutely no idea that a delivery vehicle had just turned onto the private road leading directly to the front gates. The heavy oak front doors did not just open. They swung inward with a profound echoing creak that sliced cleanly through the dying applause in the grand foyer. The sudden rush of crisp autumn air made the nearby candle flames flicker wildly, casting dancing shadows across the imported marble floor. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance, distracted from Brenda's magnificent display of fabricated generosity. Standing squarely in the doorway was not another late-arriving guest or a stray country club acquaintance. It was a man in a sharp, dark blue uniform. He possessed the rigid posture of a bonded legal courier, a professional delivering high-stakes documents that changed lives permanently. He did not look intimidated by the sea of designer gowns or the glaring crystal chandelier. His eyes scanned the silent crowd with absolute clinical detachment. In his hands, he carried a massive flat box. It was easily 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, making it impossible to ignore. True to my precise instructions to Jonathan, the packaging was breathtakingly dramatic. The box was meticulously wrapped in rich, heavy crimson velvet that absorbed the light, tied tightly with a shimmering gold bow. It looked like an extravagant piece of artwork, a gift fit for a queen. The courier took 2 confident steps into the foyer, his heavy boots clicking sharply against the marble. He cleared his throat, his authoritative voice booming across the sudden dead silence of the room. "I have a priority birthday delivery for Brenda," the courier announced loudly, ensuring every single person in the grand foyer heard him perfectly, sent with express instructions courtesy of Madeline. A collective gasp swept through the affluent crowd, followed immediately by a soft chorus of awes. The timing was almost too cinematic to be real. Brenda had just finished delivering a tearful, highly manipulative speech about keeping the door open for family members who had lost their way. And now, exactly on cue, a massive gift had arrived from the daughter she just publicly shamed. To the wealthy neighbors and the eager country club gossips, it looked like the ultimate cinematic olive branch. It looked like the prodigal daughter was finally submitting to the matriarch, sending a grand token of apology for her terrible behavior. Whispers rapidly rippled through the gathered guests. How incredibly sweet, a woman in a sapphire dress murmured to her husband. She must have felt so guilty. After watching Courtney's video, another neighbor whispered loudly enough for the front row to hear. It just goes to show you that a mother's love truly conquers everything. Brenda stood frozen on the staircase landing for a fraction of a second, her mind rapidly processing the optics of the situation. Her initial shock instantly melted into an expression of profound, intoxicating triumph. She had actually done it. She genuinely believed her relentless pressure, combined with Courtney's vicious social media smear campaign, had successfully broken my spirit. She assumed I was sitting alone, drowning in regret, desperately trying to buy my way back into her good graces. She descended the final 3 steps with the grace of a conquering empress, her silver sequined gown trailing heavily behind her. She motioned for the crowd to part, creating a clear path between her and the waiting courier. Jamal grinned, elbowing Courtney. Courtney beamed, crossing her arms in smug satisfaction. They thought this was the final piece of their perfect puzzle. With my supposed apology unfolding in front of Gregory, the illusion of the united family backing their startup was absolutely flawless. As Brenda glided past the wet bar, she paused briefly next to Thomas. My father was still clutching his empty bourbon glass, his face entirely drained of color. He did not share his wife's triumphant delusion because Thomas knew me better. He knew I did not send velvet-wrapped apologies. He knew I operated in cold, hard facts. He stared at the massive box with wide, terrified eyes, his breathing shallow and rapid. Brenda leaned in close to his ear, her perfectly painted lips twisting into a vicious, gloating smirk. She kept her voice just low enough so the guests could not hear the venom dripping from her words. "See," Brenda whispered to Thomas, her eyes locked onto the crimson velvet box. "I told you she would cave. I broke her." She patted his trembling shoulder patronizingly and continued her walk toward the center of the foyer. The courier stood perfectly still, waiting with the heavy package extended. The string quartet remained silent. The entire room held its collective breath, eager to witness the grand unveiling of my supposed surrender. They expected a priceless painting. They expected a heartfelt, tear-stained letter of apology. They were completely unprepared for the absolute devastation hidden beneath that gold bow. Brenda stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute intoxicating delight. She signaled frantically to the photographer she had hired from the regional lifestyle magazine. The photographer quickly darted to the front of the crowd, lifting his heavy camera and adjusting his flash to capture the climax of her perfect evening. The bright flashes illuminated the foyer, permanently documenting her supreme arrogance. She placed her hands on the heavy crimson velvet, making a grand show of pausing to smile directly for the lens. "Oh, Madeline." Brenda sighed loudly, ensuring her voice carried to the back of the room. She always did have a flair for the dramatic. "I suppose it takes time for some people to realize the true value of family. But we must always be gracious in victory." She reached for the shimmering gold bow. The crowd leaned in collectively, their curiosity practically vibrating in the warm air of the estate. Courtney stepped up beside her mother, her face glowing with a smug, victorious smile. With a swift practiced pull, Brenda untied the ribbon. It slipped away smoothly, falling softly to the marble floor. She peeled back the heavy crimson velvet wrapping, letting the luxurious fabric pool around her silver sequined heels. Beneath the velvet was a sleek, matte black presentation box. She unlatched the two brass clasps on the sides and slowly lifted the heavy lid. A collective breath hitched in the foyer. People stood on their tiptoes, expecting to see a commissioned oil painting or perhaps a framed collage of cherished family memories. Even Gregory, the stoic logistics mogul from Atlanta, tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing in observation. Brenda peered inside the box, and for a fraction of a second, a look of profound confusion washed over her perfectly powdered face. Her manicured hands hesitated. It was not a painting. It was not a sentimental photograph. She reached into the padded interior and gripped the edges of a massive, heavy oak frame enclosed in thick museum-quality glass. With a strained grunt, she hoisted the heavy object out of the box and turned it around so the entire crowd could see. The photographer snapped a rapid succession of photos, the bright flashes reflecting harshly off the polished glass. Instead of a beautiful piece of art, the guests found themselves staring at a stark, densely worded legal document. It was the original master deed to the Oak Creek estate. The watermarked paper bore the official raised seal of the state of Illinois and the unmistakable blue stamp of the county recorder office. Right there, printed in bold, undeniable black ink, was the section detailing the sole legal owner of the property. It clearly and definitively listed Vanguard Properties, LLC. Brenda stared at the document, her eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon. She recognized the LLC name instantly. She knew exactly what Vanguard Properties was because she had signed the lease agreement 5 years ago. The fabricated reality she had so carefully maintained began to fracture violently in her mind. Her hands began to tremble, causing the heavy oak frame to shake against her expensive sequined gown. But the master deed was not the only thing inside the frame. Plastered directly over the center of the glass, completely obscuring the middle of the deed, was a second document. It was printed on thick, heavy bond paper. The header was typed in a massive, bright red font that was impossible to miss even from the back of the crowded foyer. It read, 30-day notice to quit and demand for possession. Below that glaring red headline was the merciless legal text Jonathan and I had drafted the night before. The stark black letters outlined the immediate termination of their month-to-month tenancy. It explicitly cited the devastating reason for the eviction: breach of lease agreement due to fraudulent misrepresentation of property ownership and active commission of federal bank fraud. The silence in the grand foyer was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet that seemed to vacuum the oxygen straight out of the room. The classical music was long gone. The polite murmuring had vanished completely. 100 wealthy guests, the magazine photographer, and the powerful investors from Atlanta all stared blankly at the massive red eviction notice held tightly in Brenda's shaking hands. Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale, terrified ghost wrapped in silver sequins. Her eyes were wide with a raw, primal panic. The absolute certainty of her destruction had just been delivered on a silver platter, meticulously wrapped in velvet, and broadcast to every single person she desperately wanted to impress. She could not spin this. In the background, the sharp shatter of breaking glass echoed through the dead silence. Thomas had finally dropped his bourbon glass. It shattered against the mahogany bar, but nobody even turned to look at him. Every single eye remained locked on the blazing red lettering of the eviction notice. The sharp shatter of Thomas dropping his bourbon glass was the only sound in the cavernous space, yet it barely registered in Brenda's panicked mind. She was entirely consumed by the massive red letters glaring back at her from beneath the thick museum glass. Her manicured fingers, weighed down by rented diamonds, gripped the edges of the oak frame so tightly that her knuckles turned a translucent white. She tried to draw a breath, but her lungs simply refused to expand. Her mouth opened and closed in rapid, shallow succession, resembling a fish pulled abruptly from the water. The carefully constructed persona of the untouchable Oak Creek matriarch was actively disintegrating under the harsh, unblinking glare of the chandelier. She could not speak. She could not even look up to meet the eyes of the 100 guests staring at her. Jamal shifted his weight impatiently. From his vantage point near the bottom of the sweeping staircase, the exact text of the document was obscured by the glare of the photographer's bright flash. He had seen the blue county stamp and the watermarked paper, and his arrogant mind immediately jumped to the most lucrative conclusion. He assumed the heavy frame contained the official finalized paperwork legally transferring the estate's equity directly into his tech startup's holding account. He wanted the Atlanta investors, especially his highly skeptical father, to hear the exact magnitude of Brenda's financial commitment. "What does it say?" Brenda Jamal asked, his voice booming with unearned confidence slicing right through the suffocating tension. "Read it for the room. Tell everyone what Madeline sent us." Brenda did not respond. She did not even blink. She just stared at the word felony, her entire body beginning to tremble violently. The heavy frame swayed in her weakened grip, threatening to crash to the marble floor. Jamal chuckled a condescending sound that echoed terribly in the quiet foyer. He stepped forward, leaving Courtney's side, and confidently closed the distance between himself and his mother-in-law. "Let me help you with that," he said smoothly, reaching out with both hands to take the heavy oak frame from her failing grasp. Brenda tried to pull it back, a weak instinctual attempt to hide her absolute ruin, but her strength was entirely gone. Jamal easily took possession of the massive document. He turned dramatically on his heel, facing his father Gregory and the rest of the gathered elite. He held the frame up high, completely unaware that he was holding the very instrument of his own destruction. He did not pre-read the text. His hubris demanded an immediate theatrical performance. He cleared his throat, puffed out his chest, and projected his voice so that even the guests in the far corners of the adjacent living room would hear every single syllable. 30-day notice to quit and demand for possession. Jamal read aloud, his booming voice full of arrogant bravado. He paused for a fraction of a second, a slight frown creasing his forehead, as his eyes scanned the next line. The legal terminology did not align with the generous gift he was anticipating. But momentum carried him forward. and he continued reading before his brain could fully process the catastrophic meaning of the words. He read the next sentence with the same loud, clear projection. Effective immediately, the month-to-month tenancy of Brenda and Thomas is hereby terminated. Jamal's voice faltered slightly, but the profound silence of the room compelled him to finish the paragraph. He dragged his eyes down to the glaring red text in the center of the page. Eviction is executed due to the material breach of lease, specifically the fraudulent misrepresentation of property ownership and the active commission of felony bank fraud against First Sterling Bank. The words left his mouth and hung in the warm air of the estate like toxic smoke. Felony bank fraud. He had just broadcast the severe crime to a room full of millionaires, local business owners, and his own highly conservative investors. In the adjacent living room, the string quartet had nervously begun to tune their instruments after the glass shattered, attempting to provide some polite background noise. But the moment the words felony bank fraud echoed through the house, the lead cellist's bow slipped with a harsh, discordant screech. The string quartet abruptly stops playing. The sudden absence of that low, ambient noise made the ensuing silence feel aggressively heavy. Jamal slowly lowered the oak frame. The smug, triumphant grin had been violently erased from his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. He stared at the black ink, reading the words again in his head, desperately hoping he had misread them. But the text remained fixed. Vanguard Properties, LLC was the sole owner. Brenda was a tenant, and the loan application he had eagerly signed his name to was a massive federal crime. The crowd remained entirely frozen. The photographer slowly lowered his camera, his eyes wide. Nobody gasped. Nobody whispered. The absolute dead silence in the room was far more terrifying than any scream. The only sound was the slow, steady dripping of the melting ice sculpture in the center of the room. The local elite stared at Brenda, their expressions shifting rapidly from polite confusion to profound disgust. They realized they were standing inside a crime scene, drinking champagne paid for by a woman who was about to be indicted. Jamal stood frozen with the heavy oak frame still elevated in his hands. He was an arrogant man who built his entire persona on projecting an image of relentless success. But he was absolutely not stupid. He understood corporate structures and liability. He understood the stringent compliance regulations surrounding commercial and residential lending. And most importantly, he understood exactly what he had willingly signed his name to earlier that week. The math violently clicked into place inside his mind with sickening clarity. Just 3 days ago, Courtney had handed him an iPad as he was rushing out the door. She had asked him to quickly digitally sign the final home equity line of credit application for First Sterling Bank. He remembered skimming the digital document. He remembered seeing the Oak Creek estate listed as the primary collateral valued at over $3 million. He had signed the screen, eagerly blinded by the promise of $500,000 in liquid capital for his failing app. He had legally attested under penalty of federal perjury that all the financial information and property claims contained within that application were entirely accurate. His hands began to shake, rattling the heavy frame. If Vanguard Properties LLC was the actual indisputable legal owner of the estate, and Brenda was merely a month-to-month tenant facing an immediate eviction, then the warranty deed they had submitted to the bank was entirely fabricated. They had used a fake asset. He slowly lowered the frame, his eyes locking onto his wife. Courtney was standing right next to her mother, her face completely pale, the smug, triumphant smile entirely erased. She looked terrified, staring at the red lettering on the glass. Jamal did not feel an ounce of sympathy for her. He only felt the terrifying cold dread of a man stepping directly into a steel bear trap. "You do not own this house," Jamal asked, his voice shaking. The booming bravado from just moments ago had completely vanished, replaced by a hollow, raspy whisper that barely carried over the silence. Courtney swallowed hard, taking a small, trembling step back. "Jamal, honey, please. Mom said she had it all handled. She told me Madeline was just holding the deed in trust or something, and that we were fully entitled to use the equity. It is just a massive misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Jamal repeated the volume of his voice rising sharply, slicing through the dead silence of the foyer. You told me this estate was your family legacy. You stood right there and told my father your mother was gifting us the equity. I signed a federal loan application with you. I electronically submitted a $500,000 credit request to a federally insured bank using a fraudulent warranty deed. Did you forge the loan app, Courtney? Tears welled up in Courtney's eyes, finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. She reached out desperately, trying to touch his arm. Mom told me to sign it. She said it was just paperwork to bridge the financial gap until my sister stopped being so difficult. We did not mean to do anything illegal. Jamal violently jerked his arm away from her grasp as if she were highly radioactive. The sheer stupidity of her defense physically nauseated him. You did not mean to do anything illegal. You submitted forged documents across state lines to a bank. Do you have any idea what you have done to me? He looked around the room, his eyes wide with rising panic. He saw the wealthy country club members aggressively whispering to one another. He saw the photographer slowly backing away toward the door. And then he made eye contact with his father. Gregory stood near the entrance, his face a mask of absolute unforgiving rage. Gregory was a man who built his logistics empire on ironclad contracts and spotless credit. He realized instantly that his son was not a visionary entrepreneur. His son was an unwitting accomplice in a massive federal crime. The legal reality crashed over Jamal like a tidal wave of ice water: wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The federal government did not care if he had blindly trusted his wife and his mother-in-law. Ignorance was not a legal defense. His digital signature was permanently stamped on the application. His startup was completely dead. No legitimate investor would ever touch him again. His pristine reputation was permanently destroyed, and he was staring down the very real possibility of 10 to 20 years in a federal prison. A primal, suffocating rage erupted in his chest, burning through the panic. He looked at the heavy crystal champagne flute still resting in his left hand. The vintage champagne bubbled cheerfully, a mocking reminder of the lavish celebration they had faked using stolen prestige. With a guttural yell that echoed fiercely off the high vaulted ceilings, Jamal hurled the glass directly across the room. The heavy crystal flute sailed through the air and smashed violently against the stone masonry of the grand fireplace. Shards of glass exploded outward like shrapnel, raining down onto the pristine marble floor. The sharp, explosive crash made several guests physically flinch and step back in fear. The glamorous illusion of the elegant birthday gala was entirely shattered, replaced by the chaotic, terrifying reality of a family tearing itself apart from the inside out. Gregory stepped directly into the center of the foyer, completely unfazed by the shattered glass near his expensive leather shoes. The logistics mogul closed the distance between himself and Brenda with the slow, deliberate pace of a predator cornering its prey. His presence commanded absolute authority. He did not yell, he did not need to. His voice was low, incredibly steady, and carried the lethal weight of an executioner delivering a final verdict. So Gregory said, his dark eyes locking onto Brenda's pale, trembling face. This entire evening was a theatrical production. The estate, the wealth, the generous matching equity. It was all a complete fabrication to trick my family into funding your son-in-law. Brenda opened her mouth, a pathetic squeak escaping her throat. Gregory, please, I can explain. Madeline is just being vindictive. We have the assets, I promise you. Do not insult my intelligence! Gregory snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He pointed a thick finger at the framed eviction notice now resting on the floor where Jamal had dropped it. That document is printed on state watermarked paper. It cites felony bank fraud. You do not own this property. You are completely broke. And worse than being broke, you are a severe legal liability. Gregory turned his piercing gaze toward his son. Jamal was hyperventilating, staring at his hands as if he could physically wipe the digital ink off them. Jamal, Gregory said coldly, I warned you about taking shortcuts. I told you to verify the underwriting before you asked me for matching capital. Instead, you allowed your desperate ego and this pathetic family to rope you into a federal conspiracy. Dad, I swear I did not know, Jamal pleaded, his voice cracking. Courtney handed me the iPad. She told me it was just standard verification. I did not read the title documents. Ignorance is for amateurs, and the federal government does not care about your excuses, Gregory replied without an ounce of paternal warmth. You signed a fraudulent loan application. You committed wire fraud. My firm will not be dragged into a federal indictment because you wanted to play tech billionaire with stolen money. Gregory turned to his wife Beatrice and his brother. We are leaving, immediately. Beatrice gave Brenda one final look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. She did not say a single word. She simply picked up her designer evening clutch and followed her husband toward the heavy oak doors. The Atlanta contingent did not look back. They marched out of the estate with military precision, the heavy front doors slamming shut behind them with a definitive thud that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The abrupt departure of the wealthy investors completely broke the paralyzing spell over the rest of the guests. The local country club elite, the people Brenda had spent decades desperately trying to impress, suddenly realized they were standing in the middle of an active crime scene. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family facing federal charges. The awkward shuffling began. A city councilman hastily grabbed his wife by the arm and headed for the exit, not even bothering to say goodbye. The whispering erupted into a low roar as women gathered their expensive coats and men rushed to the valet stand. We really must be going, a neighbor muttered, actively avoiding Brenda's frantic gaze. Good luck with the indictment, another woman whispered loudly to her husband as they hurried past the melting ice sculpture. Within minutes, the mass exodus was rapidly accelerating. The grand foyer, just moments ago filled with laughter and applause, was completely emptying. Waiters began quietly backing into the kitchen, abandoning their silver trays of expensive caviar. The string quartet had already packed their instruments and slipped out the side door. Courtney watched the guests fleeing in absolute panic. Her perfect life, her wealthy husband, her social status. Everything was evaporating right in front of her eyes. She spun around and lunged toward Jamal, grabbing his arm with both hands. Her fingers dug aggressively into his expensive suit jacket. Jamal, wait, Courtney sobbed hysterically, tears ruining her carefully applied makeup. You cannot leave me. We can fix this. We can hire a lawyer and explain that my sister set us up. Madeline is just trying to ruin us. We will tell the bank she lied. Jamal looked at his wife as if he were staring at a venomous snake. The sheer delusion of her words finally snapped the last thread of his patience. With a violent, aggressive motion, he shoved her off him. Courtney stumbled backward, her high heels slipping on the marble floor, nearly falling into the puddle of water forming beneath the melting swan. Do not touch me! Jamal screamed, his voice raw and echoing through the rapidly emptying house. You are completely out of your mind. There is no fixing this. We committed a federal crime because of your mother's psychopathic need to look rich. Madeline did not set us up. You forged a deed. Courtney gasped, clutching her chest. I am your wife. Not anymore. Jamal spat, his face twisted in pure hatred. I am filing for divorce first thing Monday morning. Do not call me. Do not text me. I am calling the best criminal defense lawyer in Atlanta, and I am telling the federal investigators exactly what you and your mother did to me. Jamal turned on his heel, his expensive dress shoes crunching loudly over the shattered crystal of his champagne flute. He stormed out the front doors, leaving them wide open to the freezing autumn air. He did not look back. The freezing autumn air poured unhindered through the wide-open front doors, sweeping aggressively across the marble foyer and chilling the massive empty house. The Oak Creek estate, just an hour ago, the epicenter of high society and fabricated wealth, was now a desolate wasteland of abandoned luxury. The cold wind rustled the discarded crimson velvet wrapping paper across the floor like dead leaves. Half-empty champagne flutes sat forgotten on expensive antique side tables. The magnificent ice swan had completely melted, leaving a massive, messy puddle of water ruining the imported floral arrangements. The silence left in the wake of the fleeing guests was deafening, broken only by the pathetic sound of Courtney sobbing uncontrollably into her hands near the coat closet. Brenda stood completely paralyzed in the center of the foyer. The heavy oak frame containing the eviction notice lay discarded on the wet marble directly at her feet. For a long, agonizing minute, her brain simply refused to process the absolute totality of her destruction. Then the narcissistic collapse hit her with the physical force of a freight train. Her knees violently buckled. She collapsed onto the lowest step of the grand sweeping staircase. The silver sequined gown bunched awkwardly around her legs, making her look like a discarded, broken theatrical prop. And then she began to scream. It was not a cry of sorrow, regret, or remorse. It was a feral, hysterical shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. Her voice cracked and broke, echoing harshly off the high vaulted ceilings, stripping away the final layers of her carefully curated high society facade. She tore at her professionally styled hair, completely ruining the stiff updo. She clawed frantically at the heavy rented diamond necklace around her throat, as if the jewels were actively strangling her. Across the room, Thomas was physically incapable of comforting his wife. He had slid down the side of the mahogany wet bar and was sitting flat on the hardwood floor. His knees were pulled tight to his chest, and he was violently hyperventilating. His face was a sickly ashen shade of gray. He grasped his chest, struggling to pull air into his failing lungs, fully realizing that the impending federal charges and legal fees would completely bankrupt whatever pitiful savings they had left. His entire life was over. Amidst her hysterical screaming, Brenda saw her diamond-encrusted clutch resting on a nearby console table. She scrambled across the marble floor on her hands and knees, completely abandoning any remaining shred of dignity. She ripped her cell phone from the purse, her manicured fingers slipping and fumbling over the glass screen as she frantically dialed my number. Miles away from the suffocating, toxic chaos of the Oak Creek estate, the night air was crisp, clean, and incredibly peaceful. I was sitting comfortably on the wooden deck of my back porch, securely wrapped in a thick wool blanket. Sophie sat right beside me, leaning her head warmly against my shoulder. I had set up her telescope earlier in the evening, and we had spent the last hour quietly mapping out the constellations in the clear, dark sky. There was no screaming here. There was no emotional manipulation or performative wealth. There was only the gentle rustle of the autumn leaves and the steady, comforting rhythm of my daughter breathing. The tranquil silence was interrupted by the sharp buzzing of my cell phone resting on the patio table. The bright screen illuminated the darkness, flashing Brenda's name. I did not feel a spike of anxiety. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. I slipped my arm from around Sophie, reached across the table, and accepted the call. I pressed the speakerphone button and set the device back down on the wood. Madeline, Brenda shrieked through the tiny speaker. Her voice was unrecognizable, violently distorted by raw fury and rising panic. "You vicious, ungrateful monster! I will destroy you for this. Do you hear me? I will sue you for every single penny you have. You ruined my life. You humiliated me in front of everyone. I am going to call the police and tell them you forged that deed. I am going to take you down with me." Sophie shifted slightly under the blanket, looking up at me with wide, worried eyes. I gave her a gentle, reassuring smile and placed my hand comfortingly over hers. I leaned slightly toward the phone, letting Brenda run entirely out of breath before I finally spoke. My voice was calm, measured, and completely devoid of the emotion she so desperately wanted to provoke. "You did not want the owner of the house at your party," I stated simply, letting the undeniable reality of the situation sink in. "So the guests have to leave. You have 30 days to pack. The fraud investigator will call you Monday." I reached forward and tapped the red button, instantly cutting off the frantic, high-pitched wail echoing from the other end of the line. Without hesitating for even a second, I opened the settings on my phone, selected her contact profile, and permanently blocked the number. I immediately did the exact same thing for Thomas and Courtney. The toxic connection was entirely severed. I picked up my phone, turned the screen off, and looked back up at the infinite expanse of the night sky, finally free. Exactly 30 calendar days later, the crisp autumn air had surrendered to the bitter chill of early Chicago winter. I stood on the sidewalk just beyond the wrought iron gates of the Oak Creek estate, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. Next to me stood Sheriff Evans, his arms crossed over his heavy uniform jacket, overseeing the final stages of a court-mandated eviction. The legal process had been swift, merciless, and undeniable. Jonathan, my attorney, had executed the unlawful detainer lawsuit with absolute precision. Because Brenda and Thomas had committed federal fraud on the premises, no judge was willing to grant them a single day of leniency. I watched quietly as a crew of movers carried my parents' belongings out the front door. Without the rented diamonds and catered champagne, the reality of Brenda's actual life was laid bare for the neighborhood to see. The affluent neighbors who had eagerly consumed Courtney's defamatory video were now standing on their porches, openly whispering. The furniture being loaded into the battered moving truck was not imported mahogany. It was cheap particle board garbage, bought on credit, heavily scratched and completely ordinary. Brenda stood by the truck wrapped in a thin coat, her face pale and devoid of makeup. The untouchable matriarch was gone. She refused to look in my direction. Thomas sat in the passenger seat of their heavily leased sedan, completely broken by the looming federal investigation. First Sterling Bank had handed the forged application over to authorities, and legal fees were already bankrupting their pitiful savings. Courtney was not there to help them pack. My sister was currently moving her meager belongings into a cramped studio apartment on the other side of the city. Jamal had kept his promise. He filed for divorce the next morning, retaining a ruthless legal team that successfully pinned the entirety of the forged signature liability onto Courtney and Brenda. He saved himself by throwing them directly to the federal investigators. Courtney, the golden child, who had spent her life manipulating others, was now completely isolated. Her social media accounts had been hastily deleted, and she was facing criminal indictment without a single dime. The house of cards had completely incinerated. The heavy truck finally pulled away from the curb. Sheriff Evans tipped his hat, confirmed the property was officially vacant, and handed me the brass keys. I thanked him and walked through the front gates. Sophie was waiting for me near the driveway, bundled in a bright red winter coat. She grabbed my hand and we walked up the sweeping stone path. The grand foyer, previously the site of so much emotional manipulation, was empty. Our footsteps echoed off the bare marble. But the house did not feel cold anymore. It felt entirely cleansed. The suffocating energy that plagued my childhood was gone, replaced by a profound peace. I did not want to live in this massive house. I was already finalizing a lucrative commercial sale to a developer. But before the bulldozers arrived, I had one final piece of business. Sophie and I walked through the empty house and out onto the rear lawn. In the center sat Brenda's prized gaudy rose garden, a chaotic mess of thorny bushes she obsessed over to impress her friends. Waiting near the edge was my private contractor. I looked down at my daughter. Her smile was radiant, completely unburdened. I pointed directly at the rose garden. "Tear it all up," I told the contractor. "Every single thorn. We are building the massive 3-story custom playground my daughter has been sketching all month. I want the highest slide you can legally build." The contractor grinned and signaled his crew to start the heavy machinery. I stood there holding Sophie's hand, listening to the roar of the engines, destroying the last physical remnant of my mother's vanity. The true victory was breaking the cycle. Generational trauma ends when you realize your own worth and enforce your boundaries with ironclad power. I had liquidated a toxic asset and secured a beautiful future. Thank you for listening to my story. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more authentic stories of resilience and growth. Share this video as a reminder that our greatest challenges lead to meaningful transformations. Have you ever enforced an ironclad boundary to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments below. Remember, your story is still being written and you hold the pen.